Hello everyone, welcome to Horror Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos to relax, relieve stress, or even fall asleep. I think it would be great if you could leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from around the world. And if you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any other videos on the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. My name is Emily Morgan, and I was only 10 years old when my mother passed away from a long battle with illness. Her loss left a gaping hole in my life, one that no amount of time or words could heal. My father, devastated and lost, turned to destructive habits, gambling, drinking, and lying. He became a man I hardly recognized, a shadow of the father I once knew. I despised him. He neglected us long before my mother's death, and even in her final days, he showed more love for cards and bets than for her. I hated him for what he had become, yet he was the only family I had left. I had no choice but to stay with him, despite the growing resentment I harbored inside. The years following my mother's passing were filled with sadness and despair. I visited her grave every day, the only place where I felt close to her. Our neighbors, who had always looked down on my family because of my father's behavior, became openly hostile after her death. They blamed him for everything, even for my mother's illness. They would leave hateful notes near her grave, sometimes even throwing garbage or old food at her resting place. The sight of it broke my heart. One day, however, something changed. I was at my mother's grave, quietly cleaning away the debris left by the cruel neighbors, when I noticed a single rose placed gently on the tombstone. It was fresh, its petals a deep red. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. I wondered who could have shown this small act of kindness, given how much the community despised us. The next day, there was another rose, and then another. Every day, without fail, I would find a fresh rose placed before my mother's grave. By the end of a month, there were 36 roses. The sight of those flowers filled me with a strange comfort, but also unease. Who could be doing this, and why? That evening, I saw a breaking news story that shook me to my core. A series of mysterious deaths had been reported across town, and the number of victims was shockingly high, 36 people. As I listened to the broadcast, my blood ran cold. The victims were all people from my neighborhood, people who had at one point hurled insults and hateful words toward my mother. I made a chilling connection. 36 victims, 36 roses. When my father returned home later that night, he was his usual self, angry, drunk, and defeated by yet another gambling loss. He lashed out at me, as he often did, and I retreated to my room, desperate to avoid his rage. The next day, when I visited my mother's grave, there was a 37th rose. And that same morning, my father was found dead. His death was violent, far worse than the others, according to the police. They said it looked like someone who harbored a deep personal hatred had done this. My father's body was found in a state so brutal that it left even the officers speechless. I told the police, I didn't see anyone enter the house, I was there the whole time. How could I have missed it? The officer looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion, but nothing more came of it. Despite the doubts, they decided to place me in a local care home, where I lived for the next year. During that time, the roses at my mother's grave stopped appearing. I visited her less often, and life became quiet, if only for a while. But then one night, everything changed again. I had snuck out of the care home, desperate to visit my mother's grave. When I arrived, I was horrified to see over 100 roses piled at her tombstone. The sight made me freeze. I didn't understand what was happening, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I ran back to the care home, hoping for some sense of normalcy. But when I arrived, I found the unimaginable. Everyone in the care home had been killed. The scene was overwhelming, and I couldn't process the horror fast enough. There were more than 100 victims, matching the number of roses I had seen at the grave. I felt my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of it all. Then, out of nowhere, police cars swarmed the building. Officers stormed in, their guns drawn, and before I knew it, they were pointing their weapons at me. "Stop!" I shouted. "I didn't do anything. I just got here." But one of the officers replied, "Don't lie, Emily. We know who you are. You're the one behind all of this." I was stunned. "What are you talking about? I didn't kill anyone." but their faces were stern, unwavering. The suspicion that had been brewing since my father's death now boiled over, and they were convinced that I was somehow involved in these tragedies. I was terrified, and before I could process what was happening, I ran. I don't remember how far or how long I ran, but eventually I collapsed. A stranger found me on the side of the road, a man named David. He was kind, offering me shelter, and I stayed with him, grateful for the safety he provided. Years passed. I grew older, trying to bury the painful memories of my past, trying to live a normal life. I never spoke of the roses or the deaths again. Now at 32, I thought I had left it all behind. The mysterious killings had stopped and the world had moved on. But one evening, David, whom I had come to see as an older brother, sat me down. He looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen before, and I knew something was coming. "Emily," he said gently, "there's something you need to know about your past, about what happened to all those people." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath. "The truth is, you were involved in the deaths, but not in the way you think." My heart pounded in my chest. "What are you talking about? I didn't kill anyone, David. I was just a kid." "You didn't kill anyone directly," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But you have another side to you, a part of you that you don't remember. When you think about your mother, when you remember the people who hurt her, this other side of you takes over." I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "No, that's not possible. I couldn't have done those things. I wasn't even there when they happened." David continued, "Your other side did it, Emily. You never knew because it was like a switch, a hidden part of you that only came out when your pain and anger were too much to handle. Every rose placed at your mother's grave marked someone who had wronged her. And every time you felt that anger, this other part of you sought revenge." The room felt like it was spinning. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "But why didn't it happen when I was with you? Why did the killing stop?" David gave me a sad smile. "Because you were at peace here. You had someone to care for you, and you weren't consumed by the memories of your mother. That part of you stayed dormant. As long as you weren't filled with anger, it couldn't control you." Tears streamed down my face as I tried to process the revelation. "And the roses?" David hesitated before answering. "I left the roses at your mother's grave, Emily. Each rose was a symbol, a reminder of those who had wronged you, those your other side had taken care of. I thought it might help you come to terms with what had happened, but now I realize it might have only deepened the connection to that part of yourself." I sobbed uncontrollably, the weight of everything crashing down on me. David pulled me into an embrace, whispering soothing words as I wept. "Don't worry," he said softly. "You're safe now. As long as you don't let the memories consume you, there won't be any more roses." But a question still lingered in my mind, a question I didn't dare ask aloud. Why hadn't my other side hurt David? He knew everything. Yet he was still here, alive and well. What made him different from all the others? I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep. My mind was racing, replaying David's words over and over again. How could it be true? How could I have been responsible for so many deaths, yet not remember any of it? I tossed and turned, the darkness of the room pressing down on me as if the weight of my own past was trying to suffocate me. David's revelation hung in the air, filling the space around me with a suffocating sense of dread. I trusted him, but his explanation felt impossible to accept. A part of me, the part that clung to normalcy, wanted to reject the idea entirely. But deep down, there was a shadow of doubt, an echo of something I couldn't quite grasp, tugging at the corners of my mind. What if he was right? What if there was another side of me, something darker, hidden just beneath the surface? I had always been plagued by anger, especially after my mother's death. I had buried that anger deep inside, but perhaps it had found a way out without me realizing it. And then there were the roses, those haunting, blood-red roses that appeared like clockwork after each death. The thought sent chills through me. If David was telling the truth, then every time I had visited my mother's grave and found another rose, it was like a silent message from that other part of me. A message that vengeance had been carried out. I stared at the ceiling, my heart racing. I couldn't shake the image of the grave, of the roses, of all the lives lost. My mind was spinning and I needed answers, but where could I possibly find them? The next morning I confronted David. He was in the kitchen, making breakfast like nothing had changed, but everything had changed. "David," I said, my voice trembling, "I need to know more. You can't just drop something like that on me and expect me to move on. What exactly happened? How do you know all of this?" David turned to me, his face serious. He placed the spatula down and motioned for me to sit at the table. The weight of his gaze made my skin crawl. I knew he was about to tell me something I might not be ready to hear, but I couldn't back down now. "It's time you knew everything," he said, sitting across from me. "You deserve the truth." I braced myself. "You weren't just a victim of circumstance, Emily. From the moment your mother passed, something inside you changed. It wasn't just grief or anger. It was deeper than that. It was as if her death awakened something dark within you, something that couldn't be controlled. I only learned about this other side of you after I found you that night when you ran from the orphanage." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "When I found you, I could see it in your eyes, the confusion, the fear, but also something else. A part of you didn't know what had happened, but another part did, and it was this part that was responsible for the roses, the killings." I wanted to scream, to deny everything, but I couldn't. Instead, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since last night. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why let me live here, thinking everything was normal, when it wasn't?" David looked at me with a sadness I hadn't noticed before. "Because you needed time to heal. I thought that if I could keep you away from those memories, away from the anger, then maybe that other side of you would stay dormant. And for years it worked. You were safe here. No one was harmed." I felt a surge of emotions rise inside me. Anger, fear, confusion. "But you knew. You knew all along that I wasn't myself, and you never said anything. You just let me go on, pretending like none of it happened." David lowered his gaze, his voice barely a whisper. "I was trying to protect you, and myself. The truth is, I don't know how to stop it. I don't know what triggers that other side of you, or how to control it. All I knew was that as long as you didn't think about your mother, as long as you weren't reminded of what happened, you were safe." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood up abruptly, knocking the chair over. "So you've been keeping me in the dark this whole time, hoping I'd just forget everything? What kind of life is that?" David didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "It was the only way I knew how to keep you from hurting anyone else, including yourself." The weight of his words hung in the air. I felt trapped, like I was spiraling into a pit I couldn't escape from. My head was spinning. I couldn't breathe. Without another word, I grabbed my coat and stormed out of the house. I needed air. I needed space to think. My feet carried me down the familiar streets of our small town, but I didn't have a destination in mind. I just walked, lost in thought. Could it really be true? Could I be responsible for all those deaths without even knowing it? The wind howled through the streets, chilling me to the bone. As I walked, I passed by the local cemetery, the one where my mother was buried. I hadn't visited her grave in years, not since David had told me it was better to leave the past behind. But something pulled me toward it now, an invisible force I couldn't resist. I made my way through the rows of tombstones, my heart pounding with every step. And then, there it was, my mother's grave, just as I remembered it. But what I saw next made my blood freeze. There, lying on her tombstone, was a single red rose. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen a rose on her grave since I was a child, but now, here it was again, as if that dark part of me had been reawakened. I backed away, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not after all this time. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around and saw David standing there, watching me from a distance. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice shaky. David walked toward me slowly, his face unreadable. "I was worried about you." I shook my head, taking another step back. "No, you knew I'd come here. You knew the rose would be here." David stopped, his eyes filled with regret. "I was hoping you wouldn't see it. I thought I had more time." "More time for what?" I demanded. He didn't answer right away, and that's when I noticed something in his hand, a small black box. My stomach twisted into knots. "What's that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. David looked down at the box, his expression pained. "It's something I should have given you a long time ago." He opened the box and held it out to me. Inside was an old, worn locket. I recognized it immediately. It was my mother's. "Where did you get that?" I whispered, my hands trembling. David hesitated. "Your mother gave it to me before she died. She told me to keep it safe until the time was right." I felt a wave of emotion crash over me. "Why didn't you give it to me sooner?" "Because I was afraid," David admitted. "Afraid that if you opened it, it would trigger something in you, something I couldn't control. But now I realize you need to know the truth. You need to see what's inside." I took the locket from him, my hands shaking. Slowly I opened it. Inside was a small photograph, one I had never seen before. It was a picture of my mother, but she wasn't alone. She was standing next to a man I didn't recognize. "Who is this?" I asked, confused. David sighed. "That's your real father." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What? No, that's impossible. My father died when I was a baby." "No, Emily," David said gently. "The man you thought was your father wasn't your biological father. Your real father, he's still alive." I stared at him in disbelief. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because he's the key to understanding what's happening to you," David explained. "Your mother left you the locket because she wanted you to find him when the time was right. He's the only one who knows the truth about your other side." I felt like the ground was falling out from under me. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my family, was unraveling before my eyes. "But why didn't she tell me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why keep this a secret?" "Because she was trying to protect you," David said softly. "Just like I've been trying to protect you. But now it's time for you to learn the truth." I looked down at the locket, my mind spinning with questions. Who was this man? And what did he know about me that could explain everything? David placed a hand on my shoulder. "We'll find him together, Emily. I promise. But you need to be ready. The truth isn't going to be easy to hear." My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. My real father, the locket, the roses, the deaths. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't put together. I wanted answers, but I was terrified of what those answers might reveal. I clutched the locket tightly, my knuckles white. "David, what if? What if I don't want to know? What if I can't handle whatever it is that's out there waiting for me?" David's face softened. He knelt down, so we were eye level, his voice calm but firm. "I understand you're scared, Emily. Anyone would be, but you've lived in fear for too long. Fear of yourself, of the past, of what might happen next. You deserve the truth, no matter how painful it might be, and you don't have to face it alone." Tears welled in my eyes, but I nodded, realizing that the weight of not knowing was heavier than any truth could be. "Okay," I whispered. "I'm ready." David gave me a small, reassuring smile. "Good. We'll start tonight." That evening, David and I sat together in the living room, going over old papers and documents my mother had kept hidden away. I hadn't looked through them in years, and many of them were unfamiliar to me. There were photographs, letters, some old medical reports, and a few legal documents, most of which I didn't understand. "Here," David said, pulling out a yellowed envelope with my name scrawled across the front. It was in my mother's handwriting. "I think this might help." I stared at the envelope for a long time before finally opening it. Inside was a letter. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper and began to read. "My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to protect you. I know that by now you must have so many questions about your past, about who you really are. I wish I could have told you everything myself, but there are some things I couldn't explain when you were younger. It was too dangerous. The man you know as your father loved you in his own way, but he wasn't your biological father. Your real father is a man named Victor Hale. He and I were close for a time before everything changed. Victor wasn't like other people. He had abilities, things most wouldn't understand. And you, my sweet Emily, inherited those abilities from him. I left him to protect you, but I always knew this day would come. Victor will be able to tell you more about the power inside you, the power that you can't yet control. He can help you understand who you are. But be careful. Victor is a dangerous man. He is driven by things I can't begin to explain. I love you more than anything in this world, and I hope you will find peace in the answers you seek. But always remember, some truths come with a price." With all my love, Mom, I finished reading the letter, my heart pounding. The room felt like it was closing in on me. Victor Hale, my real father, was somehow connected to the strange abilities inside me. The same abilities that had caused all those deaths, all those roses. And now I had to find him. David was watching me closely, waiting for me to speak. Victor Hale, I whispered, tasting the name on my tongue. Do you know him? David hesitated before nodding. I've heard of him. Well, let's just say he's not the kind of person you want to cross paths with. But if he's your father, he might be the only one who can explain what's happening to you. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. How do we even find him? He could be anywhere. David pulled out his phone, scrolling through something. He's not just anyone, Emily. Victor Hale is known in certain circles, underground communities, places where people with abilities gather. He's well connected, and if we look in the right places, we'll find him. I felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear. This man, this father of mine, had lived his entire life surrounded by powers I didn't understand. And if my mother's letter was any indication, he wasn't someone I could trust easily. But I had no choice. I had to confront him if I ever wanted to know the truth about myself and about the darkness that had been following me for so long. David made a few calls, and within a week, we had a lead. Victor Hale was living in an old, abandoned estate on the outskirts of a small town, several hours from where we lived. The estate had a reputation. People said it was cursed, haunted by something far worse than ghosts. But I wasn't afraid of ghosts. We arrived at the estate just after dusk. The sky was a deep purple, and the wind whipped through the tall, gnarled trees that surrounded the property. The house loomed before us, its windows dark, its structure decayed. It looked like something out of a nightmare. David parked the car a short distance away, and we approached the house cautiously. My heart raced with every step. I could feel something pulling me toward the front door, like an invisible force guiding me forward. This is it, David said quietly, glancing at me. Are you sure you're ready? I swallowed hard, nodding. I don't have a choice. We walked up to the door, and before David could knock, it swung open. A tall man stood in the doorway, his face shrouded in shadows. His presence was overwhelming. There was something about him that radiated power, danger. I knew immediately who he was. Emily, the man said, his voice smooth but cold. I've been expecting you. Victor Hale. I stepped forward, my hands trembling. You're my father. He nodded slowly. Yes, I am, and you, Emily, are so much more than you realize. David stood protectively beside me, but Victor's attention was fully on me. He motioned for us to enter, and as we stepped into the house, I felt the air around me grow heavier. The walls seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't describe. Why didn't you ever come for me? I asked, my voice shaking. Why did you let me live my whole life not knowing the truth? Victor's eyes were cold and calculating. Because it wasn't time. You had to discover your power on your own. It couldn't be forced. I felt anger bubbling up inside me. And the deaths? The roses? Is that because of you? Is that part of the power I inherited from you? Victor's gaze hardened. The power inside you is not something to take lightly, Emily. It's ancient and it's dangerous. Your mother tried to hide you from it, but she was wrong. You can't escape what you are. David stepped forward, his voice steady. She's not a killer. She doesn't want this power. Victor turned his gaze to David, his lips curling into a slight smile. Whether she wants it or not is irrelevant. It's in her blood. It's in her very soul. I felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of fear, anger, and desperation. How do I stop it? How do I stop the killings, the roses? I don't want this. Victor's expression softened, but only slightly. You can't stop it, Emily. You can only control it. The power inside you isn't evil, but it is raw, untamed, and if you don't learn to harness it, it will consume you. I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. I didn't ask for any of this. Victor stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. No, you didn't, but it's yours now, and the sooner you accept that, the stronger you'll become. David put a hand on my arm, pulling me back slightly. We didn't come here to accept anything. We came for answers. Victor's eyes flickered with amusement. The answers you seek are not ones you'll like, David. Emily's power is tied to something far older than you or I. It's tied to her emotions, her memories, her pain. Every time she thinks of her mother, every time she remembers those who wronged her, the power is triggered. The deaths are simply the result of that connection. I stared at him, my heart racing. So I'm the one causing this? All of it? Victor nodded slowly. Yes, but you can control it if you learn how. David tightened his grip on my arm, sensing my growing distress. We're leaving, he said firmly. Emily doesn't need to be here. Victor raised an eyebrow, but made no move to stop us. Leave if you wish, but know this, Emily. You can run from your power, but you can't hide from it. Eventually it will find you. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Lisa Parker decided to visit her best friend Emma. It was her day off, and she had been looking forward to catching up over coffee. Before she left, Lisa called her husband John. I've prepared dinner for you and Sophie. It's in the fridge, Lisa said. There was a moment of silence before John responded, his voice distant and distracted. Got it. He hung up without another word, which left Lisa with a strange, lingering feeling. She shrugged it off, figuring John was just tired from work. It had been a rough week for him, after all. At Emma's house, Lisa enjoyed a pleasant evening, talking and laughing with her friend. The hours flew by, and before she knew it, it was 8 p.m., time to head home. As soon as Lisa walked through the front door, she called out, Sophie, Mommy's home. Her daughter, Sophie, came running down the stairs, her tiny feet making soft thuds on the floor. Hi, Mommy, she chirped. Her voice was sweet, but something about the way she smiled felt off, too forced. Lisa bent down to hug her. Did Daddy give you dinner? She asked, her tone casual but curious. Sophie hesitated for a split second before replying, Yes, Daddy gave me dinner. She seemed nervous, her eyes darting toward the kitchen. Lisa noticed but decided not to press the issue. She went to the fridge to check if John had actually prepared dinner as he usually did when Lisa was out. But just as she was about to open the fridge, Sophie grabbed her arm. Mommy, don't worry, I'm not hungry anymore. Lisa paused, puzzled. Sweetie, are you sure? Yes, Sophie said quickly. Daddy already fed me. There was something strange in her tone, a quiet insistence that unsettled Lisa. Deciding not to overthink it, Lisa smiled and let Sophie go back upstairs. But as the evening wore on, something gnawed at the back of her mind. John hadn't come home yet, and it was getting late. He was usually back by now. Lisa stared at the clock as it ticked past midnight. Still, no sign of him. Where is he? She wondered, a sense of unease settling over her. She tried to stay awake, waiting for him, but exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted off to sleep on the couch. Lisa woke to the soft glow of morning sunlight streaming through the curtains. Groggy, she glanced at the clock. 7 a.m. The house was quiet, too quiet. John still wasn't home. Panic gripped her as she reached for her phone, dialing his work number. When his colleague picked up, Lisa asked, Is John there? He didn't come home last night. The voice on the other end was confused. John didn't come in yesterday. He had the day off. A cold shiver ran down Lisa's spine. Her heart raced as her mind tried to make sense of what she had just heard. John was supposed to be home, wasn't he? She suddenly remembered Sophie's odd behavior the night before, and how strangely she had insisted that her father had fed her. Lisa's thoughts turned back to the fridge. She hadn't checked it last night, and now a horrible thought crept into her mind. She rushed to the kitchen, throwing open the fridge door. Inside, the food was untouched, exactly as she had left it. So who fed Sophie? She wondered. Her mind raced as she scanned the kitchen. There were no dirty dishes, no evidence that anyone had eaten dinner. John wasn't the type to leave the kitchen spotless, and yet there wasn't a single plate or fork in the sink or on the drying rack. Suddenly, a disturbing thought entered Lisa's mind. What if Sophie was lying? It didn't make sense. Sophie never lied. She was only 8, innocent and kind. But something had been wrong about her behavior ever since John got his new job a few months ago. Sophie had grown distant, quiet, almost as if she were hiding something. Lisa's hands trembled as she closed the fridge. She had to know the truth. But where could John be? Desperate for answers, Lisa decided to search the house, every room, every corner, every hiding place. She checked the living room, the bedrooms, the garage, nothing. John was nowhere to be found. The only place left to check was the fridge. With shaking hands, Lisa returned to the kitchen. Something deep inside her, some terrible instinct, told her that the answer she was looking for was behind that door. She hesitated for a long moment, staring at the cold steel handle of the fridge. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly pulled the door open again. Her world shattered. Inside the fridge, crammed in the back among the shelves and bottles, was John's body. His eyes were closed, his face pale and lifeless. Blood had pooled beneath him, staining the fridge a deep crimson. His hand clutched a piece of paper, his fingers stiff and cold. Lisa stumbled back, horrified, unable to believe what she was seeing. Her husband, the father of her child, was dead, his body hidden in their own home, as if someone had tried to erase his existence. Trembling, Lisa reached for the note in John's hand. The writing was barely legible, scrawled in a shaky hand, but the words were clear enough to make her blood run cold. "Run, Lisa, run." Her legs felt like they would give out beneath her. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at her husband's body, the realization dawning on her that something far darker was at play. She had to get out. She had to get help. But as she turned to leave, her path was blocked. Sophie stood there, holding a kitchen knife. Lisa's heart stopped. "Sophie," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What are you doing?" Sophie's face was expressionless, her grip on the knife steady. "Daddy isn't here anymore," she said quietly. "And neither will you be." Lisa's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Sophie was her daughter, her sweet, innocent little girl. How could she be standing there, holding a knife with such cold intent? "Sophie, please," Lisa begged, her voice shaking. "Put the knife down. We can talk about this." But Sophie didn't move. She took a step forward, her eyes empty, devoid of the warmth and light they once held. "You shouldn't have come home early," Sophie said, her voice eerily calm. "Now it's too late." Lisa backed up until she felt the counter press against her back. She had nowhere to go. She looked around frantically, trying to find something, anything that could help her escape. But Sophie lunged before Lisa could react. The knife came down, and Lisa felt a sharp, searing pain in her abdomen. She gasped, stumbling back as blood began to pour from the wound. She looked down, her hands pressing against the gash, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. Sophie stood over her, the knife in hand, her expression still cold, detached. Lisa's vision blurred as she collapsed to the floor, her body growing weaker with each passing second. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was Sophie, dragging John's body out of the fridge, preparing to put her mother's picture next to his. The Parker house sat silent in the days that followed. The neighbors noticed that the normally cheerful home had gone dark, and after several days with no sign of Lisa or John, they called the police. When the authorities entered the house, they were greeted by a scene of unimaginable horror. John's body had been stored in the fridge, his wounds carefully concealed. Lisa was found in the kitchen, a fatal stab wound in her stomach telling the story of a brutal, final confrontation. But Sophie was gone. The police searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no trace of the little girl. Her room was untouched, her toys still scattered across the floor as if she had just been playing. But Sophie had disappeared without a trace. Weeks passed, and the story of the Parker family spread throughout the town like wildfire. Rumors swirled about what had really happened in that house. Some said that Sophie had been suffering from some undiagnosed mental illness, while others whispered about something far more sinister. But no one could explain how an 8-year-old girl could commit such a horrific crime, let alone vanish into thin air. The case remained open, and despite the best efforts of investigators, Sophie was never found. The only clue they had was a single note found in Lisa's hand, written in a child's handwriting. "I'm free now." Lily and Ryan had been best friends for as long as either of them could remember. Growing up in the same neighborhood, attending the same schools, and sharing the same group of friends, their bond was unbreakable, or so Lily thought. It was a chilly fall afternoon when Lily stopped by a newsstand on her way home from school. She picked up a local paper, hoping to catch up on some neighborhood gossip or find something lighthearted to read. Instead, the headline grabbed her attention and sent a shiver down her spine. "Another girl goes missing. No leads in ongoing mystery." The article described a string of disappearances that had occurred over the past few months. Girls from the nearby area, all around Lily's age, had been vanishing without a trace. The thought unsettled her, especially since the most recent incident had taken place not far from her own home. She hadn't thought much about it before, but now that it was happening so close, fear crept in. That night, Lily couldn't sleep. The stories of the missing girls replayed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The fear grew until she decided to call Ryan, despite the late hour. Ryan answered on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Lily, it's late. What's wrong?" Lily hesitated for a moment, feeling silly for disturbing him, but finally said, "I read about the disappearances near our neighborhood. It's just, I can't stop thinking about it." Ryan chuckled softly, his voice still half asleep. "Come on, Lily, it's just a newspaper. You can't let stuff like that get to you." Lily sighed, feeling a little foolish. I know. I just couldn't sleep, that's all." Ryan's tone softened. "Don't worry, you'll be fine. Just try not to think about it. Get some sleep, okay?" She thanked him, but as she hung up the phone, a nagging thought lingered. Something about Ryan's casual attitude toward the situation seemed off. She shook it off, telling herself she was just paranoid. The next morning, another headline greeted Lily as she turned on the TV. Another local girl missing. Her stomach dropped. She felt a surge of panic and instinctively grabbed her phone to call Ryan. Without waiting for an answer, she rushed to his house. Maybe if they went to school together, the feeling of dread would pass. Ryan met her at the door with his usual bright smile. He seemed unbothered, as if the growing number of disappearances in their neighborhood didn't faze him. In fact, he was his usual playful self during their walk to school, cracking jokes and offering her candy like he always did. As they neared her street on the way home that afternoon, Ryan suddenly took a different route. "Where are you going?" Lily asked, stopping for a moment. Ryan shrugged casually. "I'm heading home early today. I've got some stuff to do." Lily nodded, watching as he turned down a side street. She felt strange walking home alone, the air growing colder as the sun began to set. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow sharper. She picked up her pace, eager to get inside. As she reached her front door, her heart stopped. She realized she didn't have her keys. Frustrated, she recalled how she had slipped her house key into Ryan's backpack as a joke earlier in the day. Now, it wasn't so funny. She groaned, knowing she'd have to go to Ryan's house to get it back. When she arrived at Ryan's, the door was slightly ajar. That was unusual. Ryan was always particular about locking up. Maybe he was just in a hurry earlier. She knocked, but received no answer. After calling out his name a few times, she cautiously stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet. She had been here countless times before, but something felt different. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hall as she searched for Ryan or his bag. That's when she noticed a door under the stairs she had never seen before. Curiosity got the best of her, and she reached for the handle, a part of her knowing she shouldn't, but unable to resist. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading down to the basement. A pungent smell hit her as she descended, something rotten and metallic. The dim light from a single bulb flickered as she reached the bottom. What she saw next made her freeze in horror. The basement was filled with makeshift cages, each one containing a girl, the same girls from the newspaper articles, the ones who had gone missing. They were alive, but barely. Bruised, starved, and terrified, they huddled in silence, their eyes wide with fear. Lily's heart raced. She had to get out. She had to call for help. But as she turned to run, she heard a voice from behind her. "Lily." She whipped around to see Ryan standing at the top of the stairs, his face half hidden in the shadows. His expression was calm, but there was something dark in his eyes, something Lily had never seen before. "Ryan? What is this?" she stammered, backing away, her entire body trembling. Ryan descended the stairs slowly, his footsteps measured, deliberate. "I didn't want you to see this," he said, almost sadly. "You were never supposed to find out." Lily's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Ryan, her best friend, the boy she had trusted her whole life, was responsible for the disappearances? But why? As if reading her thoughts, Ryan spoke again. "Do you know why I started this?" he asked, his voice disturbingly calm. "It's all for you, Lily." "For me?" she whispered, horrified. He nodded, walking past her to one of the cages. "I know how much you love your birthday. You always make a big deal about it, about how special the day is, how much you love celebrating." Lily couldn't breathe. What are you talking about? Ryan smiled, a twisted, broken thing. I wanted to give you the perfect gift. 28 girls, one for each day of your birth month, leading up to your special day. Lily felt like the room was spinning. Ryan, this is insane. Let them go. But Ryan shook his head slowly. I was going to stop at 28, he said, his voice soft. But then you found out, and, well, now there has to be 29. Lily's blood ran cold. She took a step back, her mind racing for a way out. Ryan, please, she begged. You don't have to do this. I'm your friend. His smile faded. That's why I didn't want it to be you, Lily. But you couldn't stay out of it, could you? That curiosity of yours, always getting you into trouble. Lily's heart pounded as she tried to move toward the stairs, but Ryan was faster. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight, painful. Don't worry, he whispered, leaning close to her ear. You'll be the final one, the one that completes the gift. Lily struggled, pulling against him with all her strength, but he was too strong. She screamed, her voice echoing off the walls of the basement, but there was no one to hear her. As she fought to free herself, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. The next day, the news reported another missing girl. This time, it was Lily Parker. Her friends and family were devastated, the community in shock. They had no leads, no clues, no idea what had happened. But in a basement, hidden beneath a house at the edge of town, Ryan stood among his gifts. 29 girls, each representing a day of the month, each taken for the birthday of the only friend he had ever truly cared about. Except now, his gift was complete. Ryan smiled to himself as he looked at the empty cage, the one reserved for Lily. My name is Mia Parker, and everything that happened in the final year of middle school still haunts me to this day. It was the night of Halloween, our school's annual Halloween party, marking the end of the year before we all moved on to high school. What should have been a night of fun with friends became a nightmare I could never have imagined. It all started harmlessly enough. My group of friends, Noah, Emma, Claire, Ryan, and I, were excited to find a place where we could play games and enjoy the night away from the crowded gym where the rest of the school was gathered. We wanted something different, something more thrilling. As luck would have it, we stumbled upon an old house on Raven Street, just a few blocks away from the school. The house stood out in the night, draped in eerie Halloween decorations, creaking skeletons, flickering jack-o'-lanterns, and fake cobwebs stretching across the windows. It looked like the perfect place for our little Halloween adventure. We assumed someone had gone all out in decorating it for the holiday. It was too enticing to pass up, so naturally we went inside. Inside, the house was clean and strangely well decorated, as if someone had carefully set up the perfect haunted Halloween party. There was no dust, no clutter, everything seemed just right. We marveled at the attention to detail. Spooky lighting, fake bloodstains, and flickering candles filled the room, creating an atmosphere that made us feel like we were walking through a scene from a horror movie. I guess someone threw a party here earlier, Ryan remarked, looking around. None of us thought anything of it. We were too excited to be spooked by the house. If anything, we thought it was perfect, dark, mysterious, and just creepy enough to send shivers down our spines without making us want to leave. We started playing games, laughing and enjoying ourselves, dressed in ridiculous Halloween costumes. I was a vampire, Emma a witch, Noah a zombie, Claire a ghost, and Ryan a pirate. We took turns scaring each other, hiding behind furniture, and jumping out from dark corners. It was all harmless fun, at first. Things began to shift around midnight. Two of our friends, Claire and Ryan, said they needed to find a bathroom. Mrs. Thompson, our chaperone for the night, gave them permission but warned, "Be careful in someone else's house. Make sure you respect their space." We all laughed it off, assuming no one would care. They left to find the bathroom, and the rest of us continued to goof around. Time passed quickly, 1 hour, then 2. Mrs. Thompson told us we'd have to leave soon, but Claire and Ryan still hadn't come back. Noah shrugged, saying, "They probably got lost in the house. I'll go get them." While Noah searched for them, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't like Claire and Ryan to wander off for so long without coming back. Something felt wrong. But before I could voice my concern, I noticed something strange near the entrance. Pinned to the wall just inside the front door was a note. It hadn't been there when we first arrived. I was sure of it. I walked over to read it, and the words sent a chill down my spine. "Thank you for visiting, TNPK." I had no idea what TNPK meant, but the note felt out of place. My mind started racing, trying to figure out what it could stand for. I showed the note to Mrs. Thompson, and she, too, seemed puzzled but dismissed it as nothing more than a prank by whoever had decorated the house. Noah returned soon after, looking confused. "I can't find them," he said. "It's like they've disappeared." We searched the house together, calling out for Claire and Ryan, but there was no sign of them. Mrs. Thompson started to worry. We checked every room, every corner, and every hallway. It was as if the two of them had vanished into thin air. That night, we left without them. Mrs. Thompson drove us home, promising to call their parents and let them know we hadn't found them yet. I didn't sleep at all that night, my mind replaying every moment in the house over and over. The next day, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was Mrs. Thompson. Her voice was shaky, and I could hear the panic in her tone. "Mia," she said, "have you heard from Noah, Emma, or Claire?" I froze. "No," I replied. "I thought they were at home. Why?" Mrs. Thompson's next words sent me spiraling into shock. "None of them came home last night. Their parents have been looking for them all morning. They're missing, Mia." My heart stopped. "But Noah was with us when we left, and Emma was texting me after we got home. How could they be missing?" "They never made it back, Mia. Their families haven't seen them since last night." I couldn't believe it. Noah had texted me right before bed, wishing me good night. Emma had done the same. How could they have disappeared? Desperate for answers, I went to my room and pulled out the note from the haunted house, the one that said TNPK. I hadn't given it much thought the night before, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to their disappearance. I examined the note closely, brushing off the dust that covered part of it. That's when I noticed something strange. What I had assumed was a meaningless series of letters suddenly became clear. The letters TNPK were an acronym: Toby, N. Noah, P. Pauline, K. Kelsey. All the missing people, including Noah, Emma, and Ryan, had names that started with those letters. The realization made my blood run cold. I was staring at a note that had somehow predicted or marked the people who had gone missing. Panic gripped me as I ran downstairs to tell my parents, but they didn't understand. They told me it was just a coincidence, that everything would be fine. But I knew something terrible was happening. Later that day, Mrs. Thompson called again. Her voice trembled as she told me the news. "They found 5 bodies, Mia. 5 students from our school." I dropped the phone. The news reported that the bodies were found scattered across town. And though they didn't release the names right away, I knew in my heart who they were. The students missing from the night before, Noah, Emma, Claire, Ryan, and Pauline, were gone. Forever. But that wasn't the worst part. The bodies had been found dressed in the same Halloween costumes they wore the night we entered the haunted house. No one could explain how they had died, but the police suspected foul play. However, there were no signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply stopped living. I locked myself in my room, unable to process what had happened. That night, I stared at my phone, rereading the last messages I'd gotten from Noah and Emma. They had both seemed fine. We had left that house together. I knew we had. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the house and the note. TNPK. Those letters weren't random. They had marked something. Days passed, and the town was in shock. No one could explain the deaths, and no one had any answers. The house on Raven Street became the center of attention, but when the police investigated, they found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of foul play, no dangerous traps or poisons. It was as if the house had been waiting for us to enter, and once we did, it had claimed its victims. I refused to go near the house after that, but it continued to haunt my thoughts. The guilt of what happened ate at me, and I blamed myself for not stopping them from going in. I had been the one who suggested we check it out. I had been the one who laughed at how perfect it was for our Halloween party. A year passed, and I tried to move on. I even convinced myself that maybe it was all some freak accident, that maybe there was a logical explanation we just hadn't found. but that was before the nightmares started. In my dreams, I would be back in the house on Raven Street. The decorations would be gone, and the walls would be bare, cold, and decayed. I'd hear the voices of my friends calling out to me from the darkened hallways. They'd sound distant, scared, and then their voices would fade into nothingness. Each time I would wake up covered in sweat, my heart racing, knowing that no matter how far I tried to run from it, the house would always be there, waiting. And then, one night, a year after the Halloween incident, I received a text. It was from Noah's number. I stared at the screen, frozen with fear. The message was short, just 2 words, "Come back." The phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a dull thud, but I couldn't move. My eyes were glued to the screen, my pulse racing as my mind tried to make sense of what I had just seen. Come back. It was impossible. Noah had been dead for a year. How could I be getting a message from his phone? I picked up the phone with trembling hands, my heart pounding in my chest. 1,000 thoughts raced through my head. Was this someone's sick joke? Had Noah's phone number been given to someone else? But deep down, I knew there was no simple explanation. The message felt too personal, too deliberate. For several minutes, I just stared at the screen, frozen in fear. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to delete the message, to forget it ever happened. But a small part of me, the part that had never let go of that night, was drawn in, unable to ignore the pull. Before I knew what I was doing, I found myself typing a response. "Who is this?" I waited, my breath shallow, as the seconds dragged on. The room felt colder, the air heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept glancing at the corners of my room, half expecting to see shadows moving, but nothing happened, just silence. Then, my phone buzzed. Another message. "Come back to the house." A wave of nausea rolled over me. I hadn't been near the house since that terrible night, but now the memories came flooding back. The eerie decorations, the unsettling note, and the way my friends had disappeared one by one. My gut twisted with dread, but curiosity gnawed at me. Why would anyone, or anything, want me to go back there? My hand hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to respond or not. But before I could make a decision, a third message appeared. "We're waiting." I dropped the phone again, my pulse racing. "We're waiting." The words echoed in my mind, chilling me to the core. I knew what it meant. They, Noah, Emma, Claire, Ryan, and Pauline, were waiting. But that wasn't possible. They were dead. This couldn't be real. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, my friends, smiling and laughing in that haunted house, unaware of the fate that awaited them. I kept hearing Noah's voice, echoing in the back of my mind, calling me back. I woke up the next morning with one thought. I needed to go back to Raven Street. I hadn't told anyone about the messages. Who would believe me? My parents had tried to help me move on after the incident, but I could tell they didn't fully understand the guilt I carried. And my therapist, well, she had tried her best, but some things couldn't be healed with talking. The only thing that would bring me any kind of closure was going back to that house. I needed to face whatever had happened there. I grabbed my backpack and left the house without saying a word to anyone. The closer I got to Raven Street, the heavier the air seemed to become, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on me, urging me to turn back. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had to know the truth. The house stood exactly as I remembered it, its eerie decorations now long gone, leaving behind only the decaying shell of an old, abandoned building. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking with every gust of wind. My stomach churned as I approached the door. It felt wrong, like I was walking into something I couldn't escape from. But I couldn't turn back now. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The inside of the house was different from what I remembered. The once festive Halloween decorations were gone, replaced by a thick layer of dust and decay. The furniture, once neatly arranged, was now scattered and broken, as though no one had set foot inside in years. But the feeling was still there, that sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my vision. Every step I took echoed in the empty space, the floor creaking beneath my weight. My heart raced as I made my way deeper into the house, my senses on high alert. I reached the center of the house, the same room where we had all gathered that night. My breath caught in my throat. In the middle of the room, arranged in a perfect circle, were 5 chairs. They hadn't been there before. Each chair was labeled with a name: Noah, Emma, Claire, Ryan, Pauline. And there, in the center of the circle, was another chair. This one had my name on it. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the arrangement. I took a step back, suddenly feeling like I had walked into a trap. But before I could turn and run, I heard it, a soft voice, barely a whisper. Mia. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The room was empty, but I knew that voice. It was Noah's. Mia, come sit with us. The voice was closer now, coming from all around me. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, my mind racing. I wanted to run, to leave the house and never come back. But something kept me there, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. Noah? I whispered, my voice shaking. Is that you? Silence. Then a soft laugh echoed through the room. I turned back to the chairs, my eyes drawn to the one with my name on it. The air felt thick with something I couldn't explain. An overwhelming presence, like the house itself was alive, waiting for me to make my move. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the chair. I sat down, my heart racing, and the second I did, the room seemed to shift. The walls creaked, the air grew colder, and the shadows in the room began to move, swirling around me like smoke. And then, one by one, the chairs around me were no longer empty. Noah appeared first, his face pale and expressionless. Then Emma, Claire, Ryan, and Pauline. They sat in their chairs, looking at me with vacant eyes, their bodies stiff and cold, as if they were merely shadows of who they had once been. Mia, Noah said softly, his voice a hollow echo. We've been waiting for you. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I could barely breathe. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a nightmare. You left us, Emma whispered, her voice filled with a sadness that cut through me like a knife. You left us in the house. No, I stammered, shaking my head. I didn't know. We were your friends, Ryan added, his voice barely a whisper, but you didn't come back for us. My chest tightened with guilt, the weight of their words pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. I wanted to scream, to explain, to tell them that I had tried to move on, that I hadn't known what had happened to them. But the truth was, I had left them behind. I had left them to die in that house without ever understanding why. You have to stay with us now, Noah said, his eyes locking onto mine. You belong here, Mia. The shadows around the room thickened, closing in on me. I felt the cold embrace of something unseen, pulling me deeper into the darkness. My body felt heavy, my mind foggy, and I realized with a chilling certainty that I wasn't going to leave this house. Not alive. Just as I felt myself slipping away, a sound pierced through the darkness, a loud crash, followed by footsteps. The door to the room burst open, and a figure rushed in, grabbing my arm and pulling me out of the chair. It was Mrs. Thompson. Run, she yelled, her voice urgent. I didn't have time to think. I stumbled to my feet, my body still numb, and followed her out of the room. Behind me, I could hear the voices of my friends calling out, their words growing more desperate as we ran through the house. You can't leave us, they screamed. You belong here, Mia. We burst through the front door, and the moment we stepped outside, the air changed. The heaviness lifted, and the world felt real again, solid, normal. I gasped for air, my heart pounding in my chest as I looked back at the house. The shadows in the windows were gone. The house was silent once more. Mrs. Thompson turned to me, her face pale but determined. I knew something was wrong, she said, her voice shaky. I saw you leave this morning, and I had a feeling you were going back to the house. I couldn't speak. I was still reeling from what had just happened. You're safe now, she assured me. The house, it won't hurt you anymore. But as I looked back at the darkened windows, I wasn't so sure.